Hey, this is Dr. Greg coming from you here at the Neurohacker Collective podcast room. And so what we're going to do today is go over really a quote that Neurohacker posted from a chapter in a book I wrote about 9 years ago. So I'll read the quote first, then give some context about the quote, and then get to the questions that we've had. So the quote was, "A robust morning appetite is a clue that our body clock is in sync. Having little to no appetite in the morning, but being hungry late at night is a clue that rhythms are out of sync." So the key thing here contextually is the idea of a clue, right? This isn't a line in the sand, black or white, always right, wrong type of thing. It's information. It's a clue, and it really comes out of my book was largely focused on weight loss and metabolic health. And one of the things as a doc working with patients I used to routinely see was what's often thought of as night eating syndrome. So in essence, people wouldn't be hungry early in the day, but would eat a large amount of their calories after work between then and bedtime. So that idea of night eating is metabolically really problematic and typically is going to contribute directly to having suboptimal weight and shape responses. So that's really where the quote comes from. And then one of the things I do want to point out is recently I interviewed Greg Potter, who's at this point one of the acknowledged experts on body clock, metabolic health, and sleep, and especially how the three intersect. So I would definitely recommend reading that because we actually go into a lot more detail on many of the issues I'll touch on superficially here in that podcast. So a couple big picture things. One is when we think of body clocks, it's important to think really in terms of we have one that's light sensitive. So that's the one that light and darkness dramatically affect. We also have what are thought of as peripheral body clocks, many of which are entrained by the timing of when we eat. And one of the things in the interview with Greg Potter that routinely comes up is this idea that we tend to get the best long-term metabolic and health results when both of those divergent clock systems are synchronized. And the way we do that is by eating essentially most of our calories during what would be considered our activity cycle, so daylight hours. And in general, we tend to get the most benefits when we've shifted those. So like our timing window should be essentially daylight, but when we've shifted more of those calories earlier in it as opposed to later in it. So the key thing here is this idea that those two disparate body clocks are synchronized by different habits, and we tend to get the best long-term results when we've done those habits in a way that sync up together. So in essence, one of the things you'd routinely see in metabolic studies, whether in animals or in humans, is this idea that calories eaten earlier in their biological day. So that for humans, that would be earlier in the day, say 7 somewhere to noon, metabolically have a different effect on the body than if we ate those same calories from, say, sunset to bedtime. So in terms of appetite rhythm, so we would essentially have what I would then think with those two body clocks, two different rhythms. So one would be our sleep-wake rhythm. So when does what I would refer to with patients as the sleep bus arrive? So what I tended to see in practice is this idea that we tend to have almost a wave of feeling sleepy, and if we override that, then it could be another hour, hour and a half, 2 hours before we would get sleepy again. So that's the idea I would characterize as the sleep bus. We have these natural rhythms of feeling sleepy at night. So in addition to the sleep-wake rhythms, we also have appetite rhythms. So typically the way appetite rhythms work is they're predictive. So if our body's used to having food at certain times, appetite will arise to really sync with when we would eat that food. So the classic thing I would see in practice is people that would say, I don't get hungry at breakfast, so I can't really make that work for me, Dr. Kelly, would have no appetite then, but have a really high appetite, sometimes at 9 or 10 at night, which metabolically isn't a great time to be eating. And so the way to fix that was to actually get some morning light and to start eating morning, typically like something for breakfast, even if they weren't hungry. And what then slowly happens what happens fairly quickly is that appetite rhythms then shift to line up with when you're starting to get food. So when we get hungry isn't particularly, prognostic for what would be best for us. So the key thing to keep in mind is that just like sleep-wake rhythms, appetite rhythms can be shifted and are shifted based on what we do and when we do it. So with those things in mind, I wanted to get to a few of the different questions that we've had. So I'm going to just go through in the order that they were posted. Some things we'll kind of double back on. So one of them was, what about if you're fasting? So we talked a bunch about fasting, both in blog posts and on Facebook Live and on another Instagram live event. And so fasting is a really general term that can encompass, honestly, quite a bit of divergent behaviors, everything from a water fast to time-restricted eating to like a 5-2 every other day fast, a range of things. So if we're talking about something like time-restricted eating, then what usually that means is we've decided we're going to eat all of our calories within a window of time. So often, like a common thing you would see in centenarians is almost a 12-hour window. In biohackers, you often see that window really squeezed down to a few hours sometimes. So if that's the experiment you're running, then, and it's working for you, absolutely great, keep running it. What I would say though is, and this goes back to my interview with Greg Potter, is the research is fairly clear that we do much better when that window is shifted to more line up with daylight early in the day as opposed to shifting afternoon and into the evening. So if metabolically, weight-wise, digestive-wise, you're doing time-restricted eating and one or more of those things isn't working, think in terms of maybe shifting that experiment earlier and see if that does work better. If we're talking more water fasts or things like that, those are temporary things, and temporary things we're not going to worry about here. How does ketosis fit in? So ketosis really is this idea that we're shifting our metabolism to start burning fats in preference to sugars. So some of that's going to happen. So I guess stepping back, when we finish our last meal at night, so say there was a time period in the Navy, my last meal ended somewhere just before 5 at night. My next opportunity to eat wasn't until closer to about 6:30 or 7 in the morning. So I had just naturally a fairly long time-restricted eating window and would wake with a huge appetite. But at that point I hadn't eaten for 14, 15 hours. And so this was back before people would measure ketones, but I would have had some in our urine. We'll start to create some degree of ketosis, even in a mild way, just by having a fairly large fast window every day. So I would say, in that sense, when you eat, if you started to eat carbohydrates, obviously that's going to largely end the ketosis period. If you eat early in the day, but you're eating like a, kind of a bulletproof high-fat thing, you'll stay in ketosis despite having breakfast. So hopefully that answers the question. But the big picture is your appetite rhythm isn't really going to be driven one way or another largely off ketosis. It's going to be driven off when your body's predicting that you're going to have food next. And that's based on what you've been doing recently. So I wondered this. I intermittently fast and naturally am not hungry until between 11 to 1 p.m., equally don't get hungry past 8, 9 p.m. Anyone have any insight? So again, that would be this idea of you're doing what we would say an intermittent fasting that's a time-restricted eating. They're eating within a window of time. And so again, Mansell, who did the Facebook Live event, he practices this type of window. I know a bunch of other biohackers that prefer to have their window shifted later in the day. And if that's working for you, great. But like I said, if metabolically something's not lined up, if your weight, shape aren't working the way you want, or if there's digestive issues or other health issues, consider shifting that window earlier. I know for me, I do much better when instead of, say this would be like a noon to 7, 8 at night window, I eat something much earlier in my like exposure to sunlight time. The next thing was listen to your body. If you're not hungry, you don't need to eat, but make sure when you do eat, you're not eating too little. So I would say I completely disagree with this. So the whole issue in the book that this quote comes from is this idea of night eating. So people that are night eaters aren't hungry in the morning, and that's causing or contributing substantially to both metabolic issues and weight problems, and it can't be corrected until typically they do two things, and that's get morning sunlight and eat in the morning. So they have to start eating there to shift the rhythm. If they keep doing what they've always been doing and just eating when they're hungry, they're not going to solve the problem. So the next question, I think I'm good at listening to the body side, but to what extent is my appetite guided by an out-of-sync body clock as a result of schedule I'm not in control of, i.e. up in time to be at work at 8:30 a.m., So I would say there's lots of things that we're not in control of, and by eating something early in our basically the sun's schedule, I'm not advocating that you have to eat like a huge meal, but I am saying that in general it's a good idea to run that experiment and eat something and see if your appetite shifting then pays dividends at the tail end of the day. And one of the things that I've often seen is if as an example, sleep issues. Sleep issues we tend to think are largely dictated by what we do at night, which is partially true, but the beginning of the day makes an outsized impact on how easy it is to fall asleep and stay asleep. So one of the things I saw with some patients was when they did start to eat something early in the day and get some sunlight early in the day, that combination of things had an outsized impact on sleep at night. So I would say no matter what our situation is, if we can integrate even a little of that, so getting something to eat, some morning sunlight, preferably somewhere in that 7 to 9 in the morning window, those would be one of the more important biohacks in my world. The next one, weird because I only get a robust appetite in the morning if I ate late at night. So I think sometimes this can have to do, at least what I've seen, with exercise. Quite often people that are trying to, especially to go into an anabolic state by doing a lot of heavy weightlifting, they can afford to, eat late at night and still have an appetite early in the morning. I would say though, in general, my experience hasn't been that there's lots of people that would fall into this category. So if it's what's working for you, go with it. But again, just pay attention to the other clues like metabolic health, so blood sugar, insulin over time. How's your immune system working? One of the key things to keep in mind is at night, our body does, based on our circadian rhythms, a lot of the repair processes. And one of those is decontaminating our stomach, which doesn't work nearly as well if there's food still being digested in it. So just again, if your health is great, everything's working for you, I wouldn't worry about it. But one of the common things I've seen with people with recurrent digestive things is they're really not giving a window of time where their body would naturally be essentially decontaminating the gut. They're still working on digesting food then. So the post indicates something is wrong if you don't have a robust morning appetite. My appetite kicks in at 11 a.m. if I wasn't forced to be in the office at 8:30 a.m. My natural waking time would likely be later, and therefore my hunger being robust in the AM wouldn't probably be an issue. So again, the appetite rhythms are completely shiftable. Our sleep-wake schedule is completely shiftable, and so we can't really rely on when they're happening as a clue to like this is great. What I guess the gist of the quote is that when we see morning appetite, somewhere in, again, that 7 to 9 a.m., that's usually a clue that rhythms are synchronized. That's all it's a clue to. It's not meaning that, your health is rocking, your health isn't rocking. When we don't see that, instead someone's only hungry at night or doesn't get hungry till much later in the day, that's a clue that we're going to probably see a lot of metabolic things going on until we correct that. What about taking into account how we ate before grocery stores? We hunted all day and ate at the end of the day. The fact we were hungry while hunting caused us to be more situationally aware and better hunters. This is a BS statement. So, good on you, however you want to frame things. But I think, one, we don't really know what hunter-gatherers did in terms of our ancestors, right? Anyone that says they do is just making it up. We'd at best be guessing based on modern hunter-gatherers. And the truth is, I think a much better population to study in terms of what we know might work long-term are people that have made it to different points and have maintained great health. So let's look at centenarians, basically the groups of people in blue zones especially that have made it to 100. Now, one of the most common findings is that they eat breakfast. So Personally, I would put a lot more weight on that population than on notions about what hunter-gatherers way in our distant past may or may not have done, because I would say there's probably lots of things that weren't optimal about their lives. So, if you have a different belief, good on you. I'm going to put my trust in what the successful people in the modern world and the characteristics of how they eat and live their life, as opposed to necessarily our ancient ancestors. Will you post a link as a new comment so we can click and download simply? So this is referring actually to this chapter, which Neurohacker and I have made freely available, and the link has been posted. So it's a cut and paste link, but it is definitely in the comment thread. 100% disagree. I've never been one for breakfast. I'll eat at around 2 to 3 p.m. and a small snack at around 8 p.m. if I'm not at work. If I'm hungry later, I'll have an herbal tea because actually I'm probably just thirsty. So again, if that's working for you, absolutely great. Personally, when I was in practice, I just didn't see that working for people that were trying to lose weight or deal with a metabolic issue or get better digestion, improve their immune system for things like autoimmunity or cancer. I just saw in general that idea of eating more of your calories into the dark area just didn't work routinely for my patients. So if it works for you, awesome. But if at some point there's an issue in any area, just think in terms of, is it worth self-experimenting with a different eating routine? I personally know from my self-experimentation, it has been for me. What if you're hungry late at night and in the morning? So we've kind of touched on that one already. And then the last one was just keep in mind that the quote, breakfast is the most important meal of the day, was invented by the Kellogg brothers to promote their new line of cereals. So I'm not 100% sure that that's not somewhat of an urban myth. I don't think they actually ever created that quote. What I would say is the big thing that the Kellogg's did, and this question ties into that, is the idea of a high-fiber cereal. In the late 1890s, one of the Kellogg's actually had what we would think of in today's terms as almost a spa, where sick people went to get better. And one of the things they did was put them on more high-fiber, cereal-based breakfast. So they definitely created the idea, or the modern idea, of a higher carb, especially like breakfast cereals, as a staple food for breakfast. And in no means am I advocating that that's the path to satisfying your morning appetite. Personally, I lived in Thailand for a bit in the early 90s, 6 years in Hawaii, spent some time in Vietnam. And in all those cultures, a much more common breakfast is going to be like pho, the Japanese noodle and vegetable-based soup would be the most common breakfast I saw when I was in Vietnam. In Thailand, breakfast, at least when I lived there, looked a lot like lunch, looked a lot like dinner. So a core thing for me is this idea that having certain foods that are only thought of as breakfast foods is probably not the optimal way to think about breakfast. A good way to eat, or I guess reconsider breakfast in the way I would have coached patients, the way I eat it myself, is anything that I would normally eat for lunch or dinner would certainly be on the menu for breakfast. So I think the key thing about this Kellogg's quote isn't that they championed breakfast as the most important meal. What they really championed was having cereal for breakfast. And I think well independent of them and way before them, and in cultures that really frankly weren't exposed to them, people still ate and do eat breakfast. And again, going back to the centenarians, one of the characteristics of those people and of blue zones is that there's a disproportionate number of those people that eat breakfast compared to what we would think of the overall population in those areas.